Welcome to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. I'm your podcast host, Landon Blake, a land surveyor living and working in Central California. Happy to have you here. Let's go ahead and dive right into today's episode.
The title of episode 19 is Leading from the Front. Subtitled, Should Your Senior Land Surveyor Be in the Field? This is actually part one. I recorded this episode with a new podcast mic, and I had a lot of popping and bumping, so I'm re-recording it. And when I recorded it the first time, it was over an hour, and I try and keep these episodes to 30 or 45 minutes. I want you guys to be able to listen to them on a reasonably short commute. So I'm going to re-record it. I'm going to work really hard not to bump the desk that this new mic is on. Hopefully that will eliminate the popping. And I'm going to split it into two. So this is part one. There will be a part two. Part one is not going to answer the subtitle question, which is, should your senior land surveyor be in the field? We will cover that mostly in part two. So I just wanted to let you know that. Up front. I think you should still listen to part one because it's going to set up part two. But if you're really just interested in that question of if your senior land surveyor should be in the field, you can skip this part one episode and catch episode 20 should be part two. I will also let you guys know I'm working really hard to eliminate my word whiskers. I'm really struggling with that. It is much more difficult than I thought. Please be patient with me. You're going to see me hesitate sometimes before I speak because I'm trying to eliminate those word whiskers. Like, so, now, I have a lot of them and I use them frequently. I'm working to get rid of them. Please be patient. What are we talking about in this episode? Let's give you an overview. We're going to talk about, number one, why thinking about leadership style and leadership development is important for your small business. When I say small business in this episode, like many of our episodes, what I really mean is a small business or organization. What we're going to talk about in this episode and the next episode is also applicable to people running a survey department for a government agency or a team in a bigger organization. So when I say small business, I want you to remember I'm also talking to the people that manage or lead those other types of teams as well. We're going to talk about, number one, why is thinking about leadership style and leadership development important? Number two, what do I think are the hallmarks of a good leader? What is a good leader? I think I've got 6 things we'll talk about. Number 3, what are the 2 leadership styles that I see most commonly at typical survey companies and why do they suck? We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about 6 aspects of leadership that the principals try and model at RH. So we have a particular, I let a so slip. We have a particular leadership style at RH. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Number 5, we're going to talk about what it means to lead from the front. So that's the leadership style that we try and follow it at RH. And so we'll talk about what that means. And I'm sorry, guys, I actually got those out of order. We're going to talk about what it means to lead from the front first. Then we'll talk about 6 aspects of leadership at RH. In other words, I'll tell you how we try and implement the lead from the front style at RH. And there's six things specific things we try and do to implement that leadership style or leadership system. What are we not talking about? I'm not going to talk today about the differences between being a good leader and being a good manager. They're not the same thing. I think I'm going to try and do a bonus episode on that. So I've recorded a half a dozen or so PYB OTM extras for the folks that sponsor us on Patreon. I'm going to try and do maybe one bonus episode, so a full 30 to 45 minute episode for our Patreon supporters. I'm going to try that once a month. I might not get to it. It might be once every 6 to 8 weeks, but I think the first bonus episode I'm going to do is the differences between being a good manager and being a good leader. There's a really excellent set of articles from that published by the Harvard Business Review. And so I'm going to research those and read through them and then try and put together a good bonus episode for you guys. I appreciate the people that are supporting the podcast on Patreon, and I think it would be nice. We'll give them some full length bonus episodes. Yeah. Every month or two, I'll try and have a bonus episode for those folks. It's going to depend to some extent on how busy I am at my day job, but I'm going to make an effort to do that. So we won't talk about that today. I think you can be a good manager and a good leader. It's hard to do both, but I think it's possible. And I think it's also important that you try and do both if you're a business owner. I think most people like me that start their own businesses tend to be good leaders and not always good managers. That can cause problems. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in the bonus episode. So we're not going to get into the differences today. Today, I'm talking about leadership, not management. Those are different things. And then we're not going to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, should your senior land surveyor be in the field? We're going to save that for part 2. We might touch on it briefly, but most of it will be in part 2. And I told you guys I'm working on my word whiskers, so be patient with me. That's just one of the disclaimers I had for this episode. All right, let me just get to the right spot in my outline here. We're going to go ahead and dive into the main part of the episode. I want to tell you guys a story. This is a true story. It happened to me. It might have been 10 years ago. It's been a while. And I was working as a survey manager, a mapping department manager. I didn't do any construction. I was working as a mapping department manager at a mid-sized civil engineering firm. We had a big job. We were doing the design surveys for a large diameter water pipeline, and I mean big. It was 4 feet around, the pipe. And we were surveying, I don't know how many miles of this pipe. It was a lot. It was miles. I don't know, maybe 10 miles. So we were doing some topo and some right-of-way surveys for this big pipe. And at one point, this pipe needed to cross one of the rivers we have here in the California Central Valley. I can't remember which river it was. It was either the San Joaquin River or maybe the Tuolumne River, but the pipe had to cross the river. And the engineers were going to basically jack and bore under the river with this giant pipe. Or tunnel under the river. I'm not sure. Maybe they might have had a tunnel boring machine for a pipe that big. And so in order to do that, they needed to know where the bottom of the river channel was because they didn't want to bore into the river channel. And so part of our scope of services was to survey cross sections at this location where the pipe crossed the river channel. I think they wanted 5 cross sections. They were like 100 feet apart. Now it's important to know if you aren't familiar with the Central Valley, California Central Valley, that in the summertime, our rivers aren't really rivers. They're more like series of interconnected pools. So there's almost no flow in them. You know, the snow melts. After the snow melt runs through the system, it gets hot and dry here. It doesn't rain. They pump a lot of the water out for farming and for the cities and towns that are here in the valley. And so there's just not a lot of water left in the rivers. So they flow slows way down and they get choked with vegetation a lot of times. So in this particular location where we needed to do the cross sections on this summer, the river was full of what's called water hyacinth, which is a aquatic weed that forms like mats, vegetative mats that float on the surface of the river. It's horrible stuff. And so in this particular summer, the river at the location we were working was full of water hyacinth, and that water hyacinth, the mats went a couple miles upstream and a couple miles downstream. So there was no way to get around it. So my crew came back after the first day or two. My field crew came back and they said, hey, we can't cut these cross sections. We don't have a way to get up across the river. I think we were going to try and do them in a float tube with a total station. Or we might have had a flat bottom boat out there. I can't remember. But they couldn't get across. And just so you know, you can't get through it with a boat. And it's very hard to get through it with a boat. And you can't walk on it, and you can't swim in it. It's like, it just makes it impossible to get across the river. So my party chief, Brent, my first party chief, Brent, had come to work for me at this company as a field survey manager. And he did a good job at that. And he told me, he said, Landon, I think we should go out and look at this with the field crew. And at this particular job, I never went in the field, almost never. I had an office job. I was running a big team. I don't know how many people. It was 10 to 20 people. It was a big mapping department team, and I was super busy. And so I rarely got out in the field, and they didn't want me in the field. But Brent said, I think we should go look at this in the field. I said, okay. Yeah, I trust him. He was a good field surveyor. So I trust him. I said, all right, we'll go out, tomorrow with the crew and we'll take a look at it. So Brent and I show up at this site. And after an hour or so, we realize, man, the field crew's right. This is just insane. Like, this is impossible. What we ended up doing is we set up a pulley system and we winched the flat bottom boat through the hyacinth. But we had to winch it, and it was super hard work. And I helped the crew. I was down in the mud and the weeds and the stickers, and it was 100 degrees outside. It was hot, and I was helping, crank this winch. I think we only got 3 of the 5 cross sections done, and it might have taken us 2 days, 2 days to get the 3 cross sections. It was really nasty, and you had to hike down, and there was no road. You had to hike down into this spot. We ended up getting the 3 cross sections. And I think what that story taught me as a young survey manager was how important it was for me to be on the ground occasionally with my crews. And I think my field crews really respected the fact that I was willing to go out in the hot weather and get dirty and muddy and scraped up with them to get that job done. I think they appreciated that and they respected that. It helped motivate them to get through that particular challenge. And so I'm really grateful to Brent, my field crew manager, that he helped teach me that lesson. And Brent taught me so many different things. I tell people I learned more from Brent than I learned in college about surveying, so many practical things. But that was a valuable lesson that he taught me as a manager, which I appreciate. Why am I telling you that story? I think it illustrates why it can be so important for the senior land surveyor to get out in the field. There was a quote. I don't know who said this quote, but the basic quote is, the most dangerous place to view the world is from behind the desk, or behind a desk. And I think that's true. Let me see if I can look that up real quick on the internet, see who said the quote, because I want to give him credit. See if we can see who said this. So I got a couple different people here. So this says it's John LeCar. A desk is a dangerous place from which to view the world. I don't know if that's true, but that's what Brainy Quote is telling me. And I think that quote's true. I think it applies to surveyors. It's really dangerous to view the world from a desk. And so it was good for me to get out. That story showed it was good for me to get out and understand what the field crew was going through and to share that hardship with them. It's really easy when you're the senior land surveyor to just sit behind your desk and say, I don't understand what the problem is. Go get it done. Quit being lazy and go get it done. Another thing my first party chief, Brent, used to tell me is, he would get mad. He'd say, it's just right there on the map, Landon. How hard can it be? Because that's what the office surveyors would tell us sometimes. It's just right there on the map. Look, it's right there. How hard could it be? And they had no idea what it took to actually get to that location on the ground. So I think that's part of what the story teaches us. So let's get to that first main point. Why is it important to think about leadership style and leadership development if you own a small business or you work as a manager of a team? So I have 6 reasons why I think that's important. The first reason is good team members quit because they hate their boss. So if you have bad leaders, that is going to have an impact on your organization. People are going to quit because they hate their boss. I've quit a lot of jobs. Most of the time I quit because I hated my boss. Not all the time, but a lot. And I think other people share that pattern with me. Losing good employees is probably the most damaging thing that can happen to your business. And I think managers and leaders underestimate how expensive it is. It's a huge cost. Employee retention is really important. That needs to be its own episode on the podcast. But that's one reason why leadership style is important in building good leaders is important, is because it's going to have a huge impact on your ability to retain good folks. So that's the first reason. The second reason is leaders have an outsized impact on the company culture. Company culture is extremely important. We have a unique culture, I think, at RH. The leaders in your organization set the tone for the culture, period, full stop. Nobody is going to have an influence on culture like your leaders do. In fact, you can have all the mission statements and, team building outings and all that other stuff that HR teams, foist on their employees to try and build strong company culture, and none of it matters if the leaders aren't setting a good example about what the culture should be. So leaders have to model through their behavior what the culture needs to be, and that's both by setting the example of what kind of behavior is desired and acceptable, and what kind of behavior is not desired or not acceptable. So you got to do both as a leader. So that's one reason why leadership style is important, is your leadership style is going to shape your company culture. The third reason this is important is that leaders, especially mid-level leaders, really focus on execution in most organizations and drive actual business results, the results on the ground. So high-level leaders, especially in large organizations, are often focused on things like strategy and risk management. Those things are important. Maybe marketing, business development. Those things are hugely important. They're critical. But it's often your mid-level managers or leaders that are actually executing the work that is currently on the company's plate. They are meeting the needs of the clients or the customers on that week. And that's important because that work, the ability to execute that work, is what pays the bills. The things that high-level leaders focus on tend to be the long term, and those are important too. But you're not going to get to the long term if you don't survive the short term. And to survive the short term, you need to be able to execute well. Mid-level leaders drive that execution. Their leadership style is going to be very important to getting the work executed. That's one thing I think we do a really good job on here at RH. My partners are very hard workers, and they do an excellent job of, when there's work to do, getting out on the ground and executing. I think actually the principals probably focus a little too much on execution, and we probably could focus a little more on some of the long-term stuff, but that is a strength that we have. The fourth reason this leadership style is important is I think bad leadership will eventually ruin a business. It will result in failure of a business. no questions. I think at some point, if you are a bad leader, your business will fail. I think it's just a question of how long is that going to take. I've actually seen this happen. There's a survey company that I used to work at that I thought was a really good company. I really liked the owner. I felt like he was a good man. He was generous and friendly. And they brought in some new leadership. And the people they brought in, I don't think shared the original leader's values. And I have just really watched that company go down the toilet under that new leadership. I mean, in every aspect that you can measure, I think they have gotten worse as an organization. And it's really sad to see that. And it had everything to do with the new leadership style and the new leaders. So bad leaders can ruin a good business. The fifth reason this is important is not everyone wants to be or should be a leader in your business. It took me a little while to figure that out. I just wanted everybody that worked for me to be on an ownership track, and I realize now that's not reasonable or even good. The reason that ties into leadership style, and this is how leadership style and leadership development are linked, I think, and that probably deserves its own little extra, but the reason those are linked is because your leadership style is going to drive, to some degree, who is a good fit to be a leader at your organization. So some people are going to align well or fit well with a particular leadership style, but not with a different leadership style. And so if you don't have your leadership style for your organization figured out, you're going to have a hard time figuring out who would be a good leader, right? And you want to identify people that are going to be good leaders for your organization and then develop them. So you have to know that. And I didn't fully understand this, I don't think, 4 years ago. I mean, I maybe a little bit, but I couldn't articulate it. Now I feel like I know what our leadership style is, and we're going to talk about that. It's lead from the front. And now that I know that helps me understand what kind of employee or team member do I need to be looking for that's going to be able to grow to a leader that follows that style, because that's our style. The sixth reason, the last one, this is important, is because nurturing future leaders of your business is hard to do. Right? It's hard to find good regular employees, much less employees that you can grow into a leader. It's really important. It's part of the reason that challenge of nurturing future leaders is why so many organizations fail at the leadership transition. I talk a little bit about that in the 2 episodes on why I don't want to buy your survey business. So it's hard. You need to start early. You need to practice at it. You need to run experiments on how to develop those leaders. You really need to understand what your organization's leadership style is before you do that. If I can, I'll try and do some research on different types of leadership styles and maybe the aspects of those. I think I've seen some articles maybe in HBR, Harvard Business Review, on that. I'll try and find some of that information, do an extra on that for this episode. Because I'm not going to talk about the different type of leadership styles today. We're mostly going to just talk about the leadership style that we try and follow at our age. But there are other good leadership styles. So you should know that. You should give it some thought. Think about what type of company you want to have, what type of culture you want to have, and then, you should choose a leadership style and understand what that leadership style is and how to implement it. The second main point of the episode is what makes a good leader. What are the hallmarks of a good leader? And I chose 6. Now you could put a lot of things on this list, but I wanted to try and keep the episode to between 30 and 45 minutes. So I just picked 6. So these are 6 aspects of a good leader that are important to me. And I numbered them here from the least important to the most important. So I'm going to start with number 6 and then go up to the most important. And I'll tell you the order, I struggled a little bit with the order. You could tweak this order a little bit and it wouldn't hurt my feelings. But I tried to roughly group them from least important to most important. Okay, so what are my 6? Number 6, a good leader corrects or provides counsel when that's needed. You'll notice that's last on my list. It's the least important. That was intentional. Unfortunately, I think many leaders think this is the most important thing they do, is discipline or provide correction. And I think that's wrong. I think that's a mistake. I think as a good leader, you should be providing encouragement and commendation way more than you provide correction or counsel. One of the things, so why is it on my list then? One of the things I've learned as a leader is this is a really important job. You don't have to do it very much, but when you need to do it, it's critical that you do it. In other words, a leader that isn't willing to correct bad behavior or help people work on their shortcomings is not a good leader. And it's hard to do that for me. I don't like those conversations. They can be uncomfortable and awkward. I have a hard time with them. I catch myself trying to avoid them, those conversations. And I've really had to work on not doing that. You got to pick your battles, but it's important to provide correction when that correction is needed for the health of your business and the welfare of your team. And that's something I need to work on. But that's on the list, number 6. So a good leader understands when it's appropriate to provide correction or counsel and gives that, even though it can be hard to do. Number 5, a good leader sets expectations and goals. And I think that's a good leader does that for both individuals and teams. So she's not just doing that for individuals. She's doing it for teams too. So your teams and your individual team members should have expectations and goals. I think that's a really important part of being a good leader. Part of being a good leader, one thing that a leader does that a manager doesn't necessarily do is a leader helps people to meet their full potential. And one way you help people meet their full potential is by setting expectations and goals. One of the things that has really surprised me and humbled me is how when I set expectations, high expectations, but reasonable expectations for my team and team members, they just meet them every time. Just every time. I mean, I can only think of maybe 1 or 2 times in 20 years when I've set reasonable expectations for my good people. They hit those targets every time. It just amazes me. It just amazes, like my team that I've got right now, they are incredible. They're not perfect, but we set goals for folks and they just slam dunk those goals. It just blows my mind. It's so deeply rewarding for me. And we're just helping people realize so much of their potential. I just think about, I hired a barista and a janitor and a young lady that was working at a little fudge shop. And that, not that there's any shame in any of those jobs, because there isn't. You got to work hard to provide for your family. But I've watched those young people develop into assistant land surveyors and field surveyors. And I mean, I can't even put into words how amazing and wonderful it is to just watch them just knock the ball out of the baseball park. It's just, they are so good at what they do. And there was so much untapped potential there, There was so much untapped potential in it. It's really rewarding to see them reach that. So I think, in order to see that as a leader, you have to set goals and expectations. Number 4, a good leader inspires. And number 5, a good leader motivates. I don't think those are the same thing. I think they're different. I think you can have people that are inspired but not motivated. I think you can have people that are motivated but not inspired. Maybe I need to do a PYBO team extra on that. I'll have to think about that. The differences between inspiration and motivation. As an example, I think you can have somebody that's highly money motivated, but that is not inspired. So you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to inspire and to motivate. Number 2, a good leader teaches. You notice that's pretty high on my list. I think that's the most important thing a leader does. A leader shares their knowledge. And again, that's part of how you help people reach their full potential, right? Is you're sharing your knowledge. It's one of the most powerful things you can do. I tell friends occasionally when they ask, I had a pretty dysfunctional family growing up, like many people in America, and especially many people I grew up in a generation that had high divorce. My parents got divorced when I was pretty young, and they were dysfunctional. My mom had some mental health issues, and my dad was an alcoholic. We had some problems, but, and we were, I wouldn't say we were poor all the time. My dad was a heavy equipment operator and a construction foreman, and there were times when he made decent money, and then there were times when he didn't make decent money. So we were poor. We were poor to middle class, depending on the type of job my dad had at the time and the time of year it was. But we weren't anywhere near wealthy or upper middle class, excuse me. And I tell people, it didn't really matter to me. When I got to be in my teen years, we lived in Northwest Montana, and we were pretty poor until I graduated college. I was pretty poor for most of my teen years. And I tell my people, it didn't matter to me, because the two most valuable things my parents did for me were they gave me a love of God and the Bible. That's just a deeply personal thing for me. I understand not everybody listening to this is religious or Christian, but for me, that was one of the things they did. The second most valuable thing they did to me was teach me to be a hard worker. That has just served me in life. If you had me go back in time and choose between having wealthy parents or parents that taught me to work hard, that were poor but taught me to work hard, I'd pick the poor parents every time. Every time. Every time. You know why? Because anything can happen to your money, right? We live in an uncertain world, but if you're a hard worker, you'll always be able to take care of yourself and your family. And so that was super valuable. The reason I tell you that story about my parents is I think it helps you understand that even if you're a leader that is flawed and imperfect, which you are, and I am, the most important thing you can share with your workers, with your employees, is your knowledge. It's not your money. Money's important too. I'm not saying it isn't. Your employees want to be able to have some of your money too, or they wouldn't be working for you. But what you teach them is probably way more valuable than the paycheck they get. And I know most of our employees at our age are pretty young, and I don't know if they fully understand yet that what they're learning while they work for us is probably way more valuable than their paycheck. I had a conversation with one of my newest hires the other day, and I was trying to explain to him that he's worth a lot to me if we care about him, and we're making an investment in him. He's a good worker. And I said, do you understand what you're worth to me? And he said, well, yeah, I'm worth my paycheck. And I said, no, you're worth way more to me than your paycheck. See, he doesn't understand, that, and I know why. He's young. But in his mind, he's just trading hours for dollars, right? But our relationship goes way beyond that, right? I'm giving him way more than dollars. I'm making a huge investment in him. Now, that's partly because I hope to get a return on some of that investment in the future, but it's also because I care about him as a young person, and I'm teaching him a profession. And that's one way that the principles at RH give to the next generation, and it's important to us. See? So that's why being a good teacher is number 2 on my list. Okay, my number 1 hallmark of a good leader is a person that sets the example, a good example. Can't emphasize that enough. You can't be a good leader and be a hypocrite. I really believe that. You can do everything else right, and if you're a hypocrite, your leadership is just gonna fall short. You have to set a good example, and this is why I think a lot of people in the business world are not good leaders. And they might be great managers, but they're horrible leaders, and that's because they're hypocrites. They don't want to live their values. There's a book called The 10 Laws of Trust that I'm listening to on audio. And in one of the very first chapters, they talk about integrity, and they talk about how you can't try and be a public figure like a CEO or a academic or a politician and have a public life of integrity, but not be a person of integrity in your private life, because it just doesn't pass the sniff test. So the example they used, I think, was David Petraeus, who was a four-star general and had a really promising military political career, but he was having an affair on his wife, and it just caused huge damage to him, right? Because that's not something that we typically assume a person of integrity would do. So I think that's important as a leader. You have to walk your talk. You gotta set a good example, and you're going to see that's an important part of being of the lead from the front leadership style too, which we'll talk about in a minute. The next point of our episode is that I want to talk about the two styles of leadership I see at typical survey companies. Give me 1 second. And I see one of these styles at big companies, and I see the other style at small companies, and I think they're pretty common. And they both suck. They're both really bad. So I wanted to talk about them. I don't think they should be imitated. So the first style I see at large companies, they are typically civil survey companies, although I have seen this kind of thing at a large survey company. And I call this leadership style the second-class citizen style. And the reason I describe it that way is because in this leadership style, there are two classes of citizens. So in some places in the ancient world, you could have two classes or multiple classes of citizens, right? Or like in some places they had castes, what they called castes, C-A-S-T-E. And I typically see this in large engineering companies where you have the engineers are kind of the first class citizens, and then you have a whole set of second class citizens. And usually the surveyors are part of that class, the second class citizens, and maybe your admin staff. And that's a really horrible way, I think, to lead. I think everybody in the business is important and should feel important and feel like they contribute. You know, we have a cleaning lady at RH that comes in once a week and cleans our building. You know, she only works for a few hours a week. She's part of the team. We invite her to all the company events. I have told my employees before, my surveyors, that she is not there to clean up after them like their mother, that they have to take some personal responsibility for the cleanliness of their workspace. You know, she's not their nanny. She is a first-class citizen of our company, and I will not let anyone treat her like she is a second-class citizen just because she's the cleaning lady. It's absolutely unacceptable behavior in my organization, and I won't stand for it. But I see that in large engineering companies especially, and I think some of that's because engineers, you know, they're highly educated usually, and they feel like they're part of this elite professional class, and they treat people they consider as less educated or non-professional as somehow less superior than them. And it's a really horrible thing that they do. And that is reflected in their leadership style. So I want to tell you a story about that. I'll try not to take too long. This was when I was a young surveyor, so I still had hair. That's how long ago it was. And I was working as a robin. And we had a job up in the Sierra Nevada mountains here in California for a little utility district. And it was a pretty big job. I think it was a week of surveying. Up in the mountains, it was summertime, it was hot, and we were crawling through the forest and getting dusty and dirty and scraped up, doing a big boundary survey. And the utility district was a cheap client. And I don't know why my company was working for them, because we didn't usually work for cheap clients, but we were working for this utility district. And they decided that to save money, the civil engineer that ran the utility district, his family owned a cabin, in air quotes, that was about 20 minutes from the job site. So to save money, instead of putting us up in a hotel, they told us, we're going to have you guys stay at this cabin. They gave us a little bit of money for food. And so we show up the first night after the first day of field work. And they call it a cabin. It was one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever stayed in. It was like 8 to 12 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. It was two or three stories, beautiful, all log.
I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. So it was like it was a ski cabin. There was a ski resort pretty close by. And so that was great. But my boss told my party chief at the time, he said, hey, call me when you get to the cabin. So we get done at the end of the day, and it's 6 or 7 o'clock at night in the evening, and we're pulling up to the cabin. My party chief calls my boss. We're getting ready to unload the equipment. And my boss says, hey, I just want to let you guys know the civil engineer whose family owns the cabin said you guys aren't allowed to shower in the bathrooms and you're not allowed to cook in the kitchen. And my party chief's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What do you mean we can't shower in the bathrooms? They're like, yeah, they don't want you guys getting the bathrooms or the kitchen dirty. So you can't use the kitchen and you can't shower. I don't remember how many nights we were there. Somewhere between 2 and 4 nights. And I don't even remember, because it was a long time ago, I don't remember how we bathed. I don't know if we bathed in the creek or if we scrubbed down in the garden hose. What I do remember is that as a field surveyor in that situation, I was treated somehow as less than human or like I was a dirty or contaminated human. I can't even believe I have to tell you that story. I'm so appalled by it now, looking back. And I was young. I didn't know any better. I'll tell you what, if that had been me now, I'd have drove off that mountain the first night and marched into my boss's office and told him, you're never, ever, ever asking me to stay in a place where I can't shower again. Now, just to be clear, it's a different situation if your job site is so remote that there isn't a civilized place to stay and you got to camp out. I've done that a few times, and that's okay. But even in that situation, I would make sure that my field crew had a portable shower. But see, they felt okay asking us to do that because we weren't first-class citizens, see. We were less than human. And there's no excuse for that. And that experience shaped my life. Being treated in that way taught me I will never, ever treat another human being like this, ever. Because it was a horrible feeling. It was horrible to be treated like I wasn't good enough to use the shower in the place I was staying the night. So that kind of encapsulates, I don't know of a better way to encapsulate that leadership style, what I call the second-class citizenship leadership style. It's a horrible style, and I think it's in the long run, it's detrimental to an organization. But I see it in a lot of large companies, especially civil engineering companies. I see people, there is a group of second-class citizens, and it's a horrible way to lead an organization. All right, I picked on engineers. Now I'm going to pick on surveyors for a little bit. So the second leadership style I see at small survey shops most frequently. And I call this model the Grateful Grunt model. So what is the Grateful Grunt model? Okay, or the Grateful Grunt style, leadership style. So in the Grateful Grunt leadership style, the senior land surveyor basically says, your job is to follow me around with a paint can and a bag of stakes. You don't talk. You don't ask questions. You do what you're told when you're told. And just be happy you have a job here. If you do that for 5 years or 6 years, and I'm in the mood, I might actually teach you something. So I call it the Grateful Grunt, the Grateful Grunt style. In other words, you should just be great. You're the grunt. You should just be grateful you have a job. So what's my problem with that leadership style? The main problem is there's no knowledge transfer there, right? And as I mentioned above, that's one of the most important things a leader does. I think that was number 2 on my list, right? Is a good leader teaches. And so there's very little teaching in that model. And I know a lot of surveyors that run that model, and they just rotate through Grateful Grunts, right? And again, one thing it has in common with the second-class citizen leadership style is you're treating your subordinate as less than you. And not just, they are less than you in some extent when you're measuring skill and ability in the profession, but they aren't less than you as a human being. And that's the big problem with both of those models. They're both horrible, right? And so, and you can recognize this model if you know what to look for. You've got a certain
group of people that, they take out the trash, they clean the gutters, they're the first people laid off or with an hour cut. They're the last person invited to company events. They're not compensated fairly. The company doesn't invest in them. And we don't do that at our age. I will take out the trash. When our cleaning lady is on vacation, I clean the office and scrub the toilets. And I do that on purpose. I do that because I'm trying to model the type of leadership we want. And in that model, everybody has the same type of citizenship. I am not too good to scrub a toilet if that's what needs to be done. And that's my partners, Brian and Danny, the other principals, follow that model as well. All right, so don't practice those two leadership styles. If you run a survey organization, they're horrible. And if you practice those styles, I don't think you're a good human being if you do that. All right, to wrap up, I want to talk about what does it mean to lead from the front, and then we're going to talk about how we try and implement that leadership style. That's a particular type of leadership, and we'll talk about how we try and implement that at our age. So what does it mean to lead from the front? I have 6 things that lead from the front means. So as I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the quote, you don't get to sit behind a desk all the time. A desk is the most dangerous place to view the world, right? So you have to get out from behind your desk. The second thing is you're the first to bleed and you're the last to bleed. So in other words, you feel pain before your people as a leader. I want to remember to do a PYB OTM extra on Alexander the Great, because I think he was a really awesome leader, at least at the first part of his military career. I geek out on history, and I think he was, there was a reason he was called Alexander the Great, and part of it was how he led. Just a real quick short story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I read this about Alexander the Great. In one of the sieges that his army was doing, nobody wanted to be the first person over the ladder, because that's dangerous. So nobody wanted to be the first man over the wall. And the story is that Alexander the Great, grabbed his sword and was the first man up the wall. And that's the kind of man I could follow, right? I would have followed Alexander the Great. That's the type of leader I could follow. So maybe we'll do an extra on that. So you're the first to bleed. You own your own mistakes and you work directly to fix them. One of the things I hope makes RH a special place is, as principals, we try and admit our mistakes and then take responsibility to fix them. And we make mistakes. We're imperfect. And we work hard to be transparent with our people about that. I'd say about twice a month, I'm probably getting on our team chat and letting people know that I dorked something up and what I'm doing to fix it. And my other partners do that as well. And it's hard. I think it's hard. It's a hard quality to cultivate, but we do that. We try and admit our mistakes and then take responsibility to fix them. We try and practice what I call practical humility. I talked about it a little bit, but no job is too small or unimportant. That's part of leading from the front. Another aspect of lead from the front is you aren't above the rules. So again, this gets back to there's not two classes of citizens, right? So the principals at RH follow almost all the rules that our other employees follow. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And then the other part of lead from the front is you sweat, freeze, get thirsty, get hungry, and bleed with your people. That's what Alexander the Great did. That's part of what I did that day on the river when we were trying to cut the cross sections across the river that was filled with water hyacinth. And it's important for your people to see that you're willing to do that with them. So those are the 6 things I think that 6 characteristics of the lead from the front leadership style. So you don't get to sit behind a desk. You're the first to bleed. You own your mistakes and work to fix them. You practice practical humility. You aren't above the rules. And you share hardship with your people. Okay, so how do we try and practice that at RH? There's 6 ways we try and do that at RH. So number 1, all principals manage jobs for clients. So we all do technical work. So we don't have a managing principal. I'm probably the closest thing we get to a managing principal. I don't think we'll ever have a full-time managing principal. In other words, a principal that doesn't do actual technical work for clients. I think it's good for all the principles at RH to deal with the client and to run a project. It keeps us close to the action, helps us identify and fix problems. So we all manage jobs for clients. We all do technical work. Now, some of my technical skills are getting a little rusty. I'm not as good at CAD as I used to be because I just don't get to use it as much. But we all do technical work, and all three principals have CAD on their computers, know how to use it. Not just CAD. We all use Trimble Business Center. We all use QGIS. We all use Excel. So we do technical work. Now, we have done a pretty good job of delegating most of our admin work. We have 2 or 3 really good admin staff, support staff. But we're not afraid, any of the principals, to roll our sleeves up and do administrative work when we need to. Number 3, and I talked about this earlier, but at RH, the principals follow the rules. So we participate in the same PTO program. We follow the same team handbook. We follow those same rules. I'm surprised at times how, I know that's unusual because I sometimes when I hire new employees, they have a visceral negative reaction to that. I had a great project coordinator. I really loved her. She's not with us anymore, but she did a fantastic job. And she sometimes would get upset when she would see me following the rules that the rest of the employees followed. And she'd say, well, I don't know why you're doing that. You're the boss. You shouldn't have to do that. For example, I'm on the team schedule with everybody else. And she'd say, it's not anybody's business what you're doing. You're the boss. You shouldn't put yourself on the schedule. And I would have to try and calm her down and tell her it's okay. It's all right. I try and follow the rules that my employees follow. Now, there are very few exceptions for the principals and that's mostly because we're salaried and we make sacrifices, financial sacrifices and other sacrifices. So for example, if my partner Danny, if he was, I don't know, if he was out at a surveyor's convention and took his wife to dinner and bought her a couple glasses of wine, I wouldn't have an issue with that because he makes a ton of sacrifices for the company. So they get a little more, Brian and Danny, my partners, get a little more leeway than maybe than our average employee would get. But we basically follow all the rules that our employees follow. And I think that's an important part of Lead from the Front. All of our principals work in the field, myself included. I try and get out on a regular basis. We're going to talk about that more in part 2, next episode. But we all work in the field. We all get dirty. We all own work boots. Number 5, all the principals try and put the needs of the team first. So when we sit down and are trying to make a decision, we try and put the needs of the team ahead of our own. Now, there's a balance there. I think one of the mistakes I made the first 4 years is I asked my partners to sacrifice too much for the team. And so there's a balance. You can't put your partners into bankruptcy. So we're trying to find that balance. But I would say more than at any other organization we've worked, the leaders at RH, we try and put the needs of the team ahead of our own needs. And number 6, and this is the leaders bleed first. I'm always the first person to skip a paycheck, and I'm the last person to get paid. Every time. If we're short on a payroll, and sometimes we are, it happens a few times a year despite my best efforts, I'm always the first person to skip. And my partners, Danny and Brian, they're second in line to skip. We feel that pain before our people. And there's some really good, there's some positive aspects to that. And even sometimes my partners are like, you should pay yourself. I'll skip a check. You should pay yourself. And I tell them, it's okay. I'm going to skip a check because I'm the majority shareholder. The buck stops with me, and being the first person to not get paid gives me an incentive to make sure that we're managing our finances properly. And so that's part of how we try and implement that Lead from the Front style. All right, I'm going long. I'm at 53 minutes. So in conclusion, what do we talk about today? We talked about what is a good leader, right? I gave you the 6 hallmarks of a good leader. We talked about why leadership style and leadership development is important for your small business. We talked about the styles of leadership, the 2 styles of leadership I see at typical survey organizations, right? We had the second-class citizen style and the grateful grunt style. We talked about what I think it means to lead from the front, which is the leadership style we try and practice at RH. And then we talked about 6 ways we try and implement that lead from the front style at our company. Next episode, This will be part 2. We're actually going to answer that question. Should your senior land surveyor be in the field? That's related to that idea of lead from the front. We'll talk about some of the disadvantages and advantages of that model. And then I've already recorded the next episode, which will now be episode 20, which is how do you find good clients for your business? That was a question a friend of mine asked if we could cover on the podcast, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Appreciate you guys listening. Thank you very much. As we wrap up the podcast today, I want to do a couple things. I want to let you guys know where you can find the podcast, and I also want to let you know how you can support the podcast if you've enjoyed it. So let's start with that first thing. Where can you find the podcast? The podcast lives on the web at landonblake.com/PYBOTM. So if you go to my website, landonblake.com, up at the top, you'll find a menu. Go to Learn. It's the second link in the Learn menu. That'll take you right to the podcast. We have got links to download all the episodes there in MP3 format, and we also have the show notes. You can also find the podcast on YouTube, youtube.com/@PYBOTM. All of the episodes are also uploaded there. We have the podcast on Spotify, so you can find the podcast in all of those places. Second thing, how can you support the podcast? There's a few different ways you can do that. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast, reach out to me with an email, phone call, or text message. We can talk about your job opportunity for senior land surveyors, or if you have a high quality product or service for land surveyors and mappers, we could also talk about that on the podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or Spotify. Tell a friend about the podcast. Share one of your favorite episodes on social media for us. And then finally, if you'd like to make a real difference, you can go to the On Point Workshops page at Patreon. We've got a tier there, membership tier for $20 a month. You can join and support the podcast, and you get extras. We call them PYBOTM extras there. So we try and do 1 or 2 extras from each episode, video and audio, as just a little thank you to the folks that support us for $20 a month. So if you got the price of a medium pizza in your budget and you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is on Patreon. That will help me pay for Carly. Carly is the virtual assistant and digital marketing extraordinaire that helps me with all of the unseen back-end work on the podcast. So editing, maintaining the web page, doing the show notes, that kind of stuff. Carly's great. I'd like to keep her around. One way you can help me do that is by becoming a subscriber or a member on Patreon. So appreciate everybody that's done that already, and I also appreciate the thank you notes I've gotten from several of you for the podcast. That makes a difference. I know everybody's busy. I appreciate you guys taking some time out of your busy schedule to send a thank you note. So please support the podcast, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.